Throughout the Tudor period, there were a few queens who ruled in their own right for the first time across England, and a number of other brilliant consorts who advised their often brutal and ruthless husbands. Henry VIII is known for having 6 wives, 2 of these who he executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. But in the days, weeks, and years after their deaths, these 2 queens were subjected to rough and brutal treatment as their remains were searched for, and one would be dug up, the other dissolved into the fabric of the dirt inside of the Tower of London's chapel. The first Tudor Queen, Elizabeth of York, also had her tomb broken into a number of times, as did the final wife of King Henry VIII, whose body was subjected to a shocking degree of posthumous defilement. But those 2 women who ruled as Queen Regents in their own right, Mary I and Elizabeth I, both had their burial vaults disturbed also in the years following their deaths. In this documentary, we look at the opening of these coffins, vaults and urns, and we look at the disturbings of the Tudor Queen's remains and corpses. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
The most notorious and brutal king ever to rule over England was King Henry VIII, who is best known for the fact he had 6 wives. But his most influential wife was Anne Boleyn, and many historians have claimed that she was the most significant consort that has ever existed in English history. Her marriage to Henry VIII caused a huge amount of religious changes across England, and many people could not support Anne, as she was seen as a homewrecker at the expense of the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Because of Anne and the changes to religion and government, there were many normally peaceful people, such as monks, who were subjected to harrowing executions, being hanged, drawn and quartered, and some of the most powerful courtiers, such as Sir Thomas More, would lose their heads on Tower Hill. Anne Boleyn, though, despite being queen, would spectacularly fall from power and grace, and the king's adviser Thomas Cromwell planned her downfall. And this resulted in Anne being accused of incest, adultery and treason, and she would lose her head inside the walls of the Tower of London. Anne is still buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower, but her coffin was broken into during the reign of Queen Victoria, and it was opened. And what those men found was earth-shattering and incredible. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was asked from her apartments inside the Tower of London to come with the lieutenant of the Tower for her execution. There had been a scaffold made on the north side of the White Tower, and this would become the execution platform, where a Queen of England would lose her head. It was groundbreaking and crazy. The thought of the wife of a king being executed for a number of false charges. But this was Henry VIII's way of ridding himself of Anne, a woman who attracted a huge amount of controversy. She walked up to the scaffold gracefully, and when she got there she made a short speech to the witnesses that were gathered. She said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." The executioner was a French swordsman, known as the Sword of Calais, and Anne had heard his stellar reputation herself. The swordsman readied himself, and Anne knelt on the scaffold. She did not lay her head on the block. The French swordsman took off his shoes whilst his assistant distracted the queen, and with one clean swing of his sharp weapon, the head of Anne Boleyn was taken clean off. Following the execution, The executioner collected Anne's gown and walked off with this, along with his weapon, and he then began his journey back to France. Whilst this was happening, the ladies-in-waiting that had been appointed to Anne Boleyn while she was in the Tower gathered up her body and her head in an oak chest which had previously been used to house bow-staves. They then carried the remains of Anne into the chapel and the small church next to the scaffold, and Anne was buried in a hastily dug grave with very little pomp or ceremony. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, a historian in 1848 visited the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and he said of this that, "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." Over the centuries, the chapel had fallen into a bad way, and the Constable of the Tower, who took the job in 1876, agreed that it was time that important work was to be done to restore the place where a number of Queens of England were buried, and also where some of the most influential Tudor figures were also interred. During this work, Queen Victoria stated that she wanted the chapel to be a place which was fit enough to house the remains of queens. The chapel also contained the remains of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, and when renovation work began on the floor, thousands of bodies were found under it, and it was said that, on removing the stones of the pavement, it was found, as reference to the burial register too abundantly proved, that the resting places of those who had been buried within the walls of the chapel during the troublous times of the 16th and 17th century had been repeatedly, and it was feared almost universally, desecrated. As the Tower of London was not really used as a royal residence or a home for the monarchy anymore, the chapel was not looked after, and it was just seen as a normal parish church where locals would come for services each week. Also, a number of local parishioners were buried in the Tower alongside Anne Boleyn, and it was said that it is true that the bodies of those who had perished on the scaffold or died as prisoners within the walls of the Tower were buried, no doubt intentionally, in some great obscurity. But even if some memorial stone had recorded their burial place, it is doubtful whether that would have protected their remains, for in the instance of the three Scotch lords, Lovat, Balmoral and Kilmarnock, although their grave was specifically marked by a stone, which is still preserved, it was found that their bones had been much disturbed, so much so indeed as to be beyond all possible means of identification. It is even feared that in some instances coffins had been designedly broken up and their contents scattered in order to make room for some fresh occupants of the ground. But when the work on the chapel's uneven floor began, the builders would make some remarkable discoveries, including the remains of those men and women who were executed inside of the Tower. They then came across the remains of Anne Boleyn. The archaeologists exhumed the remains of Anne, and they noticed a number of things. First, that this woman's body had been beheaded by a sharp instrument, and also that the oak coffin or chest she had been buried in had rotted over the centuries after she was buried. The Professor of Medicine for Queen Victoria, Dr. Frederick Mowat, was then summoned to the Tower to identify and handle these remains. The body was found at a depth of 2 feet, and the remains were described as belonging to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. He then stated, "The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belonging to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square, full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Dr. Mowat claimed that the woman in the grave was around 5 foot to 5'3" throughout her life, and he confirmed that her head had been severed from her body. This narrowed down the possibility of those who were executed in the Tower to that of Margaret Pole, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Jane Boleyn. He said that the neck of the woman was characteristically small, which is in keeping with what he knew about Anne Boleyn and her proportions, but the record of burials, which had also been recorded centuries ago, noted also that Anne had been buried roughly in this area. Her body was then taken away, and it was held inside of the Queen's house inside the Tower, being stored in a new coffin, a lead box and a container. All of her bones and remains were placed in this, and for 5 months they were inside of the Queen's house, until the day came to then bury her inside of a new grave and a burial site back inside of the chapel. On the 13th of April, at around midday, there were 7 men, including the chaplain of the chapel, gathered to witness the reburial of Anne Boleyn. The bodies, along with Anne's, had been identified, and these were also buried in new locations beneath the altar. The men watched as the boxes were buried around 4 inches below the surface, and as careful note was taken as to who was buried where. On top, where Anne was interred today, is a marble decorative tile that marks where she's laid to rest, and she's buried between her brother George and also Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector of King Edward VI. The men that discovered the bones of Anne Boleyn had uncovered a 300-year mystery as to where the most controversial wife of King Henry VIII had been buried. The doctor of Queen Victoria was certain that this was Anne, and still today she's buried in the same location. Her coffin had disintegrated and rotted over time, and she was not allowed a proper coffin, one which would have been lead-lined, as she was a queen, but her remains were instead unceremoniously stuffed inside of a repackaged oak box. This was a disgrace for such an important queen, who today is considered a victim of her husband, King Henry VIII. One of the most shocking and notorious queens ever to have ruled over England was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who was known as Bloody Mary. She was the queen who burned over 200 people at the stake for their differing religious beliefs, and Mary's short but brief reign was one which was very turbulent. She would reverse the huge religious changes her brother Edward VI and father made, and this led people to be rather confused, and they did not know where they stood. But Mary's reign was not long, and many believed she would never be a ruling queen. However, Mary suffered with a lot of severe health problems in her life, and these eventually contributed to her death. Mary I died at the age of 42 inside of St James's Palace, and Mary was then buried inside of a burial vault in Westminster Abbey, close to where her grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, were buried. But the burial vault of Mary I was disturbed a number of times, and shockingly, when it was last opened, what those people found was shocking. Mary I, despite being the ruthless monarch who burned many people at the stake, was a woman who suffered a great deal with her health and well-being. She was a young woman who had many problems that led to the royal doctors and physicians considering that she would not live very long, and the physicians believed she would die before she would ever become queen or be considered to have been a martyr. She was living in the 16th century, a time where there were huge disease outbreaks plaguing England. Mary suffered with a number of serious swellings in her stomach when she became queen, and she believed she was pregnant, but no child ever came. And today it's considered that she suffered from ovarian or uterine cancer. But in 1558, Mary I made preparations for her death, and she claimed that she wanted Philip II to act as the regent if she ever had a child, but this would not be popular, as Philip was hated. There were never any children ever born to Mary I, and with this she then had to consider who her successor would be, and she turned to her great rival, Elizabeth, her half-sister, who would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I. In 1558,
there was a huge amount of influenza and flu, which was causing chaos across England, and it was killing people at the rate of which the Black Death was. The flu lingered on, and it would claim its victims over time. But Mary tried to avoid the disease, but in the summer of 1558 she was suffering with depression and a huge lack of sleep. It was said in August that Mary had dropsy, and she had a fever which was low, and because of this she was considered on death's door. Because of this, Mary moved from Hampton Court Palace to St James's Palace, and she did have a high fever, bouts of dizziness and confusion, and also severe headaches. Mary also went blind, and she did recover a bit. However, with her growing depression and severe fever, she continued to go downhill. In the October of 1558, many of Mary's advisers had to make a decision, and the Privy Council then convinced the Queen to make her will, and they considered their own positions, and many began to schmooze Elizabeth in preparation for Mary's death, and they wanted a role inside of her new government. But in her final days, Mary did name Elizabeth her successor, and she went blind as her servants began to pray for her soul. She had bizarre dreams, and in the morning of the 17th of November 1558, she had a final mass said for her, and at around 4 a.m. she died peacefully. The servants believed she had fallen asleep, but she died, and the doctors confirmed her death. The funeral service was then planned, and it was to take place at Westminster Abbey. Mary I's reign over England was very short, but she made history, being the first queen to reign in her own right after being crowned during a coronation. And she was interred inside of Westminster Abbey. Her body was taken to Westminster in a large procession. On top of the coffin was a lifelike effigy of Mary, which was wearing coronation robes, and it had her orb and sceptre on the coffin also. It was Mary's show of royal power and importance even in her death, and despite the fact she was a very unpopular monarch, the funeral procession then made its way into Westminster Abbey. But Mary was then buried inside of the north side of Henry VII's Lady Chapel. There, today, is little that marks the reign or life of Mary I in her death and demise. There's no funeral effigy or tomb. There isn't a grand memorial either, just a small stone that says that Mary I was buried there. But in the 19th century, the tomb of Mary I was broken into and opened. However, one thing to consider is that this was not the first time it was broken into. Elizabeth I, following her death, was initially buried inside of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's tomb, but James I, her successor, then ordered the exhumation of Elizabeth so that she could be buried in the same vault as Mary. Because of this, Mary's coffin was moved, and actually, in an act of disgrace against the former Catholic Queen, Elizabeth I's coffin was placed directly on top of Mary's to signal that Elizabeth was much more important than Mary. But in 1880, Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, encountered the burial vault of Mary I, and he wrote an account on what he saw. He found the coffins of Mary and Elizabeth, and he recorded what he saw, and he said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a long, narrow vanlet immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was a Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover, on each side the August initial E.R. and below the memorial date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow modelling panelling, and the coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid contained the inscription, and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak covers, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the two Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been hereto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. But still today, the death and life of Mary I is not the most celebrated inside of Westminster Abbey, and Elizabeth I's tomb, which sits above Mary's body, is grand and ornate. Mary I was never given her own burial vault, unlike many other kings and queens buried inside of Westminster. Her vault is not filled with the coffins of others, and still today it's believed only her and Elizabeth's coffin lay in the vault. Henry VIII is remembered today as the notorious Tudor King of England who had 6 wives, and 2 of these would lose their heads inside of the Tower of London. But Henry VIII's final wife was Catherine Parr, who many believed nursed the king in his final moments before he died. However, Catherine was a woman who, despite being a survivor, could very easily have experienced execution herself. She came close to losing her head or being burned at the stake as a heretic for being too radical in her religious beliefs. But following Henry's death, Catherine Parr scandalously married quickly. But following giving birth to a daughter, she succumbed to death herself, and she was buried closely to the rooms where she passed away inside of the walls of Sudeley Castle. However, her coffin was broken into and disturbed a number of times, and what those who broke into her remains did was shocking and harrowing. Catherine Parr was believed at the time of the Tudor period to have been a too radical Protestant, and many inside of Henry VIII's government believed she was leading the king down a path of more ruthless religious changes, and she was not the most popular woman. She was a woman who had married before, and Henry's final wife was very different to his other wives, and she was more of a scholar than a doting wife. She married Henry VIII inside of Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of July 1543, and was made the first Queen of England, who was also made the Queen of Ireland. She was the Queen up until Henry's death, and she had throughout her life even acted as the regent whilst the king was away in France. She involved herself in educating the future Elizabeth I. However, after the king's death, Catherine Parr fell in love again with Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, and he was sniffing around for more power. The pair had a long history together, and Seymour saw his opportunity to marry the new Dowager Queen as a way of getting closer to the throne. His brother Edward Seymour was made the Lord Protector of Edward VI and the chair of the Boy King's Regency Council, and Thomas Seymour was very jealous about this. Edward Seymour was now acting almost as a king. However, Catherine Parr and Thomas married in secret, but when the information about this came to light, there was a huge scandal. Catherine's actions in accepting marriage so shortly after Henry's death were seen as shameful and disgraceful, and Edward VI was not impressed with this, and Catherine then joined forces with her new husband to take on Edward Seymour. However, despite never being pregnant before or having any children, she became pregnant with Seymour's child, and at the time childbirth during the 16th century was incredibly risky. It could be a death sentence for a woman, and Catherine's risk was heightened as she was slightly older. Complications could have been fatal. At the time, she was living inside her husband's castle, Sudeley, and she continued to help educate Lady Jane Grey. the 9-day queen, whilst being pregnant, but then she entered her bedchambers to give birth to a daughter, who arrived on the 30th of August 1548. But Catherine Parr never recovered from childbirth, and on the 5th of September she died inside of her rooms days after giving birth. After her death, Thomas Seymour left his castle, and the funeral was arranged, and it would become historic, as it was the first fully Protestant service to occur across England. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, and Catherine's body was embalmed inside of her bedroom by physicians, and it was then taken inside of the chapel, St Mary's Chapel, next to the castle, and she was prepared for burial. She was to be buried in a huge ornate tomb that was made for her, and was then placed on the north side of the chapel, and on this tomb was an effigy of Catherine, and it had a Latin inscription on the bottom of it. However, Catherine Parr's remains were disturbed many times over the following years, and her coffin was shockingly broken into. In 1642, the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife was destroyed during the English Civil War, as Roundhead forces of Parliament's army smashed up the chapel and desecrated her monument as she stood for monarchy. However, her body was also disturbed, and the grave was smashed to pieces and dug up, and it was said that there is in the castle a godly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments. However, in 1782, a number of people arrived at Sudeley, and a group of ladies who had an interest in history wanted to find the remains and tomb of Catherine Parr. Inside of the chapel, they found a block of alabaster marble in the north wall from her tomb, and some men dug underneath it, and they came across the lead-lined coffin of Henry VIII's sixth wife. These group of people then opened the coffin, and what they found was remarkable. They found Catherine Parr's body wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, a heavy wax dipped in cloth which had been almost mummifying her to preserve her. They saw her face for the first time in 2 centuries. However, as her corpse was exposed to the air for the first time, the colour of Catherine's face drained, and her eyes turned a different colour, and lost their sparkle. The women then asked the men, after their curious outing, to rebury her body inside of the coffin. But a local farmer found out about what had happened inside of the church nearby, and he tried to inspect the body of Henry VIII's sixth wife himself. It was said that, in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Q.K. Parr lay interred was removed at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more. Her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased. But to his great surprise, he found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, and the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said that the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from her cloth and dress which was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that the shoes were on the feet which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine Parr was yet again opened. This time it was a curious local priest who wanted to see the state of her body, and he had found that the head of Catherine had totally decayed, and presumably no skin was left. He also found that teeth had fallen out of her mouth, or may have been pulled out by those hungry to take a souvenir of a wife of Henry VIII. However, he also found when inspecting the remains that her hands and arm had turned brown, and he made a short sketch of what he saw in her body. He then covered up the body, but 6 years later, one of the most shocking parts of Catherine's desecration occurred. A group of drunk vandals entered the chapel, and they then disinterred Catherine Parr out of the coffin and messed around with it, and one man even danced with the corpse of Catherine Parr. They then dumped the body of her in the corner in a pile, making off with some more teeth, and one man allegedly even stabbed an iron bar through the torso of Henry VIII's final queen, and then had buried this in the ground upside down. Hearing of this, a local priest then appealed to Queen Victoria to give Catherine Parr a better and deserved burial in a final monument where she could finally be laid to rest after centuries of desecration. It was agreed that Catherine would be buried inside of a new coffin and a new tomb which was made from stone, and she was interred in safety. When the time came to rebury her inside of the newly renovated church within the grounds of the castle where she died, it was found that Catherine's body was just a pile of bones now, with a smaller part of flesh and hair on her body. But she was then buried inside of this new tomb where she still lies today, in decency. The horrific story of those people who opened the coffin of Catherine Parr were a mix of criminals and curious, and she was in death not given the respect that she deserved, but she is a woman who is considered a survivor of the brutal reign of Henry VIII, but she could have experienced execution herself. But what happened to her coffin over the centuries was shocking and barbaric. One of the greatest queens to ever reign over England was Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch. It was during her decades on the throne that she saw the Elizabethan period, a time of great change where writers such as Shakespeare were thriving, and she managed to also see off some great threats to her throne. Elizabeth I ended the life of one of her greatest opponents, Mary Queen of Scots, by having her executed inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. But Elizabeth I also managed to defeat the Spanish Armada, the greatest enemy and army of the time across Europe, but Elizabeth was a queen who was loved by her followers and population, and she was very popular. Following her death in 1603, there was a huge outpouring of grief across England and the nation, and many people could not see what the nation would be like without her reigning over them. However, following her death, she was interred in a burial vault with her grandfather, Henry VII, before she was then dug up and moved to her final resting place. But what is this burial vault like, and why was it broken into? It was in the morning of the 24th of March 1603 that Elizabeth I died. She had suffered in the final months of her life with depression, and she had ruled for a very long time. But she was an elderly woman by the standards of the early 17th century, and she had lived for some time. She had defied many bouts of illness throughout her life, and she had beaten smallpox, a deadly disease that struck many people across England every year. But one issue that Elizabeth's court had with regards to her death was what to do with the throne following her death. She did not have any children. Because of this, the Scottish King James was invited to reign over England and Scotland, and he was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, the very woman that Elizabeth had executed. Elizabeth I in her final days was very depressed, and she often was very vacant and seemed deep in thought. She was contemplating the executions that she had ordered, and this included the execution of Mary, and she believed that this would stop her getting into heaven because she had sanctioned the execution of another anointed queen, who many believed had been sent by God to rule the Scots. But Elizabeth I was almost 70 when she went onto her deathbed, and she was accompanied by her closest friends and servants, and she was then attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He offered the Queen spiritual guidance, and he told her that she would rule again in heaven as a queen. But her close friends who had died in the months before were in her thoughts, and Elizabeth believed she would one day see them again in the afterlife. And she was told to hold God in her thoughts who would guide her through. However, the Queen's throat swelled and she struggled to speak, and because of this, many knew that death was coming. Inside of her private bedroom in Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I died, and she had left instructions as what should happen to her remains following her death. She specifically did not want to be disemboweled during the embalming process, but this was not listened to. During this process, the royal doctors and physicians cut open the Queen's body, and they removed her heart and also her other organs, and then her chest was stuffed with spices to keep away decay in an effort to preserve her before her funeral. But this proved to be the correct decision, as during the procession to her burial site of Westminster Abbey, it's believed that her body exploded due to the release of a number of gases, and that the explosion then even splintered the coffin and caused damage to it. However, Elizabeth, after her death, was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin which had been decorated with Tudor imagery, and she was left inside of Richmond Palace before it was then time for the funeral procession. The journey was rather long, and it gave the public a chance to see their queen and to pay their respects to her. Elizabeth's coffin was placed on the royal barge and was then transported down the River Thames and then travelled towards the Palace of Whitehall. The coffin was covered in black velvet and her ladies kept watch on it. However, it was claimed that during the procession on the Thames that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, and it was a very sorry sight. One onlooker wrote of the funeral procession that begun on the 28th of April 1603 that the city of Westminster was subcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. On top of Elizabeth I's coffin was also her funeral effigy, which was dressed in her Parliament robes, and on the head of the effigy was the crown of the Queen. In her hands were the sceptres of power, and this was significant, as this was a first time for most that they had seen an image of their Queen. When the coffin arrived at Westminster Abbey, it was carried into the church by the yeomen of the guard, and the funeral of the Queen was conducted by Dean Andrews of Westminster. And following this, her coffin was taken to the Lady Chapel ready for burial. To begin with, the burial vault was actually the same as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's, and she was buried under the tomb of her grandparents, which was said to have been an honour, and at the heart of the Lady Chapel. But then following this, her body would be moved later on. James I, the Queen's successor, was determined to win over his new population, and one way in which he did this was to honour Elizabeth, as she was so popular. He ordered a large tomb to be built for her, but he also ordered that Elizabeth should be exhumed and then moved to a different vault, the vault being her half-sister's, Mary I's, resting place, and it was then said that Elizabeth's coffin should be placed directly on top of Mary's to express her dominance over her half-sister in her reign. This tomb for Elizabeth is huge and is still there today, and she was buried in a room opposite her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. It was said that 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of Elizabeth's body, and then for the reburial in the new vault. However, in 1880, a book was published by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, and in this he documents his exploration into the different vaults and burial sites of Westminster Abbey. He had been given special permission to look inside the royal vaults, and he wanted to locate the coffin of King James I. And he did find this in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So James had moved Elizabeth I out of this vault so that he could then be buried inside of it. But Arthur Stanley then explored some other rooms from the royal vault, and he came across an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I. And he found a small opening in the wall where he then crept through and entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I and Mary I. There were no other coffins, but Elizabeth I's remains had been laid to rest for 2 centuries. He wrote about what he saw and said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow vault immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger, and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately, the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side, the august initials E.R., and below, the memorable date, 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the two Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive form, the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been inherited too, explored in the other part of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. Not since Arthur Stanley ventured into the burial vault of Elizabeth I has anyone, it's believed, ever been in and documented what they saw. It's considered a sacred space, and the final Tudor monarch is laid to rest in a better manner than others inside of Westminster Abbey had been.